When I think back to my childhood, what comes to my mind first is not laughter, not the warmth of a mother's hug, not the encouragement of a father's hand on my shoulder, but the endless echo of words that cut deeper than any knife. Words that told me I was not enough, that I would never be enough, that poverty was stitched into my very skin and that I would never escape it no matter how hard I tried. I remember waking up in a house where silence was heavy, where smiles were rare, where every coin was counted and every meal felt like a battle won. Yet instead of compassion, instead of family pulling closer in hardship, there was ridicule, there was bitterness, there was a constant reminder that I was a burden dragging everyone else down. My clothes were never new, often patched and torn, and I can still feel the sting of shame when other children would laugh at me, pointing at my shoes that had holes big enough to let the rain in. But what hurt more than their laughter was that my parents did nothing to shield me, they only added to the chorus, saying I should get used to it because I was born poor and poor I would remain. I remember nights when hunger gnawed at my stomach, but before I could even gather courage to say I was hungry, I would hear my mother say that feeding me was like pouring food into a pit that would never be filled, and my father would laugh as if my very existence was some kind of mistake that fate had played on them. I would look at their faces and wonder how parents could look at their own child with such coldness, how they could not see that I wanted nothing more than their love, nothing more than their faith in me. But what I got instead were comparisons, endless comparisons to others, to children who came from families with money, who had bright futures handed to them on golden trays, while I was constantly reminded that I was too poor to dream, too poor to hope, too poor to imagine myself as anything other than invisible. School was not an E. There were days when I would walk miles just to sit near the hospital in town, watching the doctors and nurses in their clean white coats, watching the cars pull in and out, the sense of respect people gave to those who worked there. I would stand there, hungry, tired, my shoes covered in dust, but my mind full of thoughts, thinking of how different life would be if I could belong in a place like that, if I could build something bigger than my pain, if I could create something no one could take away from me. But every time I tried to voice even the smallest dream, every time I whispered to myself that maybe I could be something, their voices would return, sharp and unrelenting, saying I was born poor and nothing could change that. I would lie awake at night staring at the ceiling, my stomach growling, my heart heavy, and yet in those dark hours I would also dream, quietly, secretly, stubbornly, because even in the worst of times I refused to let their words be the final truth of my life. I remember one particular winter, the cold biting through the thin walls of our home, frost forming on the inside of the windows, my breath visible in the air as I tried to study under the faint glow of a kerosene lamp. My hands were shaking, my body craving warmth, but my mind was focused on the pages in front of me. I could hear my parents in the next room, arguing as always about money, about how unlucky they were to be stuck with me, about how I would never bring them anything but shame. Their words seeped through the thin walls and wrapped around me like chains, but instead of giving up, I pressed harder, reading the same lines again and again until they sank into my memory. I told myself that every cold night, every cruel word, every moment of hunger would one day become the stones I would step on to climb higher, that one day I would not just escape this life but rise so far above it that they would not even recognize the child they once mocked. The years of rejection became I learned very early that home was not a place where encouragement lived. It was a place where my smallest mistakes were magnified into proof that I would never amount to anything, and where my achievements were dismissed as accidents or as things that did not matter because they would never change the fact that I was poor. When I brought home good grades, papers with red stars or teachers' notes praising my efforts, I wanted so desperately to see even a flicker of pride in their eyes, but instead I was met with indifference. My father would say grades do not put food on the table, and my mother would say books cannot fill an empty stomach. Their words crushed my excitement, leaving me standing there with a paper in my hands that suddenly felt meaningless. Over time, I stopped expecting them to care, but I never stopped wishing that just once they would. The lack of belief in me was not hidden, it was public. They would speak about me in front of relatives, in front of neighbors, as if I were not even in the room, saying that I was destined for failure, that I would never escape the chains of poverty, that I should not waste time dreaming of anything better. Those words became part of my identity in the eyes of others, too, because when your own parents do not believe in you, why would anyone else? I can still remember the sting of hearing relatives whisper about me, the pitying looks from neighbors, the way they would nod in agreement when my parents declared that I was too poor to be anything. It felt as though the entire world had conspired to remind me of my place, to shove me into a corner I was never meant to leave. At night, when I lay in bed staring at the cracked ceiling, their voices replayed in my mind like a curse. Sometimes I would cry quietly into the pillow, muffling my sobs so they would not hear, but more often I lay there in silence, my chest heavy with the weight of their words. It was not only that they said I could not succeed, it was that they sigh. Ing day, waiting for the moment when I could finally turn that flame into proof that they had been wrong all along. Silence became my strongest weapon, because while my parents' words struck at me like stones, I learned that answering back would only lead to more pain, so I held everything inside and turned my suffering into fuel. Every harsh laugh, every insult, every time they said I would never amount to anything, I tucked it away in my heart and let it harden into determination. I stopped expecting kindness, I stopped hoping for praise, but I never stopped observing the world around me, noticing how those who succeeded were not always the ones born with riches, but the ones who refused to surrender. In those quiet hours when no one was watching, I made a promise to myself that one day I would break free from the cage they had built for me, not with words, but with proof so undeniable that even they would have to see. I began with small steps, holding on to whatever opportunities came my way, no matter how little they seemed. When they told me studying was useless, I studied harder, late into the night when the rest of the house was asleep, tracing letters under the dim light of a kerosene lamp, memorizing formulas and lines of text until my eyes ached. When they mocked me for dreaming of a better future, I let their voices fade into the background and focused on the voices inside me that urged me not to give up. I understood that I could not change their opinion overnight, but I also understood that if I gave in to their disbelief, then their prophecy of failure would become real. And that thought terrified me more than anything, so I clung to my determination like it was the only thing keeping me alive. There were days when I felt like collapsing, when exhaustion and hunger pulled at me, when the burden of carrying their rejection grew too heavy, but in those moments I reminded myself of the life I did not want. I would look at my father's weary face, lines etched. But my determination was not loud or visible, it lived in the quiet corners of my life. I did not boast about my goals, I did not argue when they told me to stop dreaming, I simply kept working in silence. To the world, I looked like the same poor child, the same burden my parents always described, but inside me a storm was brewing. I understood that revenge did not need to come in the form of anger or harsh words, it would come in the form of transformation, in the undeniable evidence of what I could achieve. And the beauty of that revenge was that it required no confrontation, no shouting, only patience and relentless effort. Every insult became a stepping stone, every dismissal became a lesson in resilience. I started to realize that the very pain they inflicted on me was shaping me into someone stronger, someone who could withstand hardships without breaking. Their disbelief, though it hurt deeply, became the very reason I pushed forward. I thought of it as carrying a heavy weight uphill. The climb was exhausting, but it was also building muscles I did not even know I had. While they believed they were holding me down, they were unknowingly training me to rise higher than I ever would have without their cruelty. The thought gave me comfort in the darkest times, a secret satisfaction that one day they would realize the power of the fire they had lit within me. As I grew, I began to distance myself emotionally, learning not to seek validation from those who refused to give it. Instead, I validated myself through small victories, celebrating the moments when I solved a difficult problem, when I managed to outscore others despite my lack of resources, when I saw even a glimpse of progress that only I recognized. Those moments became my private fuel, proof that I was moving forward, even if no one else could see it. In many ways, my parents' rejection forced me to become self-reliant, to find strength within myself instead of waiting for others to believe in me. Over time, those small victories began to accumulate into something larger, a foundation strong enough to hold the weight of my ambitions. I earned the respect of mentors who saw the fire in me, who offered guidance and opportunities that I seized with both hands. I saved every coin, spent sparingly, and invested in my education as though it were gold. While others my age sought comfort or entertainment, I sought progress, understanding that every sacrifice now would become a building block for the life I envisioned. There were days when exhaustion threatened to overwhelm me, when failure knocked at my door and whispered that I should give up, but each time I remembered the voices of my parents telling me I was too poor to succeed, and that memory lit a fire that carried me through. As my knowledge grew, so did my confidence. I began to see myself not as the poor child they had labeled me, but as someone capable, someone strong, someone with the power to shape his own destiny. I started to dream bigger, to envision not just survival but success on a scale that would make the world take notice. Still, I kept those dreams hidden, guarding them like treasures. I knew better than to share them with my parents, who would only laugh and tear them apart. Instead, I confided in my work, in the hours spent buried in books, in the sacrifices made in silence. I carried my vision like a torch, illuminating the path ahead even when everything around me seemed dark. Building success in secret became my greatest strategy. The world outside my home began to recognize my progress, but within those walls, I remained the same quiet figure, careful not to reveal too much. There was a certain satisfaction in that secrecy, in knowing that while they believed I was failing, I was in fact climbing higher with each passing day. Their ignorance became my shield, allowing me to work without interference, to construct a future they could not begin to imagine. I learned to let their words wash off. As I worked, I began to see the world differently. Where once I saw only barriers, I now saw opportunities waiting to be seized. I understood that wealth was not only about money, but about knowledge, about connections, about persistence. I sought out people who could teach me, who could open doors I had never imagined, and each encounter added another piece to the puzzle of my success. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, I began to rise, my efforts bearing fruit that grew sweeter with each passing season. I felt the shift within me, the transformation from the child mocked for poverty to the adult building a life of strength and possibility. The more I achieved, the more I realized the power of silence. Keeping my success hidden was not just a necessity, it was a choice. I wanted the moment of revelation to be undeniable, to strike like lightning when the time was right. I wanted my parents, who had laughed at my dreams, to see with their own eyes what I had built in the shadows. That vision sustained me, kept me focused, gave me strength on the days when fatigue threatened to drag me down. The thought of their disbelief turning into stunned silence became one of my greatest motivators. There were moments when I longed to tell them, to stand before them and announce what I had accomplished, but I held back, reminding myself that timing mattered. Success revealed too early could be attacked, undermined, or dismissed, but success revealed at the perfect moment would be impossible to deny. And so I waited, biding my time, continuing to build, continuing to rise. Each day brought me closer to that moment, each sacrifice brought me closer to the day when their words would shatter against the reality of who I had become. The secret of my growth became a kind of armor, a shield against the pain of their disbelief. When they told me again that I was wasting my life, I smiled inwardly, knowing that the truth was already unfolding in ways they could not see. When they mocked me for I had been informed that a pair of patients were being admitted, both elderly, both in need of urgent care. I did not know who they were at first, only that their condition required immediate attention, and so I moved through the corridors, my heart calm, my face carrying the professional composure I had cultivated over the years. But then I saw them. My parents. The same faces that had loomed over me during childhood, with eyes full of doubt and voices sharp with cruelty. Time had aged them, carved deeper lines into their skin, turned their bodies frail, but their presence was unmistakable. For a moment, I froze, the weight of memory pressing down on me with such force that I felt like a child again, standing in front of their ridicule. The years seemed to collapse into that single instant, but then another realization struck me with equal force: this was not the past. This was the present, and in the present, they were vulnerable, standing in a place they did not yet realize belonged to the very child they had rejected. They looked around with the same air of discontent I remembered, complaining about the wait time, about the cost, about how life had been unfair to them. I watched quietly, unnoticed, my staff treating them with kindness and patience they had never shown me. I could have revealed myself right then, could have walked up to them and spoken my name, but I held back, savoring the power of the moment. It was not cruelty that kept me silent, It was the deep, unshakable need to let the truth unfold naturally, to let them see with their own eyes what their disbelief had blinded them to for so long. I observed as they were led into a consultation room, as the doctors they once would have said were beyond my reach now treated them with respect, as the system I had built wrapped around them in care they never thought I could provide. Every step they took inside that hospital was a silent testimony to the years of struggle they had dismissed. I remembered how they